The sky over Germany is a graveyard of aluminum, a place where young men fly into storms of steel, their survival no longer expected, only hoped for. It is the winter of 1943 and the American daylight bombing campaign is being systematically slaughtered. But a single, quiet pilot, a man who thinks in equations and angles, is about to rewrite the brutal mathematics of the air war. The winter of 1943 carved itself into the very bones of every American airman who was stationed in England. The cold was a physical, malevolent presence. Ice would form on the inside of the cockpit glass, obscuring the view of the world below. A man's breath would freeze solid inside his oxygen mask, a constant, claustrophobic reminder of the thin, frigid air at 20,000 feet. Fingers would go numb inside the electrically heated gloves that more often than not failed at altitude. Below, the familiar, comforting green patchwork of the English countryside would vanish for weeks at a time beneath an endless, impenetrable blanket of fog. And above, on the rare, clear days, the contrails from hundreds of B-17 and B-24 bombers would etch a series of white, geometric scars into a grey and utterly merciless sky. This was the height of the combined bomber offensive, the great, strategic gamble that was supposed to bring the Third Reich to its knees. The United States Army Air Forces in particular believed in a new and unproven doctrine, daylight precision bombing. It was a doctrine that had been built on a uniquely American combination of confidence, of technology, and of an almost religious faith. It was a faith in the Norden bomb sight, a miraculous mechanical computer that, its proponents claimed, could allow a bombardier to place a 500-pound bomb into a pickle barrel from a height of over 20,000 feet. In theory, the plan was sound. Tight, disciplined formations of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators, bristling with 50-caliber machine guns, would be able to protect themselves with their own overlapping fields of fire. They would fly deep into the heart of Germany in broad daylight. They would smash the enemy's war industry, the ball-bearing factories, the aircraft plants, and they would return home, their formations battered but fundamentally intact. In practice, it was a slaughter. The German day fighter force, the Luftwaffe, had adapted to the American threat with a speed and a lethality that the American planners had simply not expected. The German pilots, flying their formidable Messerschmitt Bf-109s and their powerful Focke-Wulf FW-190s, did not engage the bombers in the kind of swirling, romantic dogfights that were depicted in the newsreels. They were cold, they were professional, and they were brutally efficient. They had developed a tactic that was almost unstoppable. They would climb to an altitude high above the lumbering bomber streams. They would position themselves miles ahead of the formation, and then in carefully coordinated waves, they would roll their aircraft inverted and dive straight down through the American formations in a series of devastating head-on attacks. The physics of these encounters were terrifying. The closing speed between the diving German fighters and the oncoming American bombers would often exceed 500 miles per hour. The bomber gunners, sitting in their cramped, freezing turrets, would have just a few fleeting seconds, and sometimes less, to react. The twin 50-caliber machine guns in the bomber's nose turret, their primary forward-facing defense, could not traverse fast enough to track the fast-moving German fighters. The Germans knew it. The Americans knew it. And by the late months of 1943, the once clear skies over Germany had become a graveyard. The loss rates on some of the deep penetration missions to places like Schweinfurt and the industrial Ruhr Valley began to exceed 20%. Entire bomber groups, dozens of aircraft and hundreds of men would simply disappear in a single afternoon. The crews in the damp, cold Nissen huts of the English air bases began to count their missions the way that prisoners of war count their days. Survival was no longer an expected outcome of a completed tour. It was something that was simply and desperately hoped for. Into this brutal and unforgiving environment came thousands of young men who had, just a few months earlier, been living quiet, ordinary lives. They were farm boys from Iowa, they were mechanics from Detroit, they were college dropouts and factory workers, and they were now being asked to climb into thin, unpressurized aluminum tubes and to fly straight into a storm of steel and fire. They learned the hard lessons of formation discipline. They learned the critical importance of oxygen management. They learned how to aim a heavy machine gun with hands that were numb inside frozen gloves. But no one, not their instructors, not their commanders, could teach them how to survive a coordinated, head-on attack from a squadron of Luftwaffe aces. There was no manual for that. There was only the brutal, unforgiving, and ever-present mathematics of the grinder. James Howell. Howard did not look like a man who was destined to change anything. He was quiet, he was reserved, and he was deeply, almost unnervingly, analytical. He was not the square-jawed, charismatic fighter ace of the popular imagination. He was, in a world of loud and aggressive men, an almost invisible presence. He was born in 1913, not in the heartland of America, but in the sprawling, chaotic city of Canton, China. His parents were American medical missionaries, and Howard grew up in a world that was surrounded by a multitude of languages, of cultures, and of a constant, simmering uncertainty. His father ran a medical mission. His mother taught at a local school. From a very early and formative age, Howard had learned a critical lesson, a lesson that would come to define his entire approach to the world. He learned how people solve immense and complex problems without the comfort of backup, without the promise of reinforcement, and without any guarantee of success. He returned to the United States for his college education, and he enrolled at Pomona College in California with the intention of studying pre-medicine. But the siren song of aviation, the new and thrilling science of flight, pulled at him with a force that was stronger than the pull of anatomy. In 1937, he joined the United States Navy as an aviation cadet. He washed out. Not for a lack of skill, not for a lack of intelligence, but because of a minor, almost insignificant medical issue. For most men, that would have been the end of their dream of flying, but for Howard, it was just a temporary setback. If his own country's military would not have him, he would find another way. He went back to China. In 1941, as the world was tilting ever closer to a global war, he joined a small, now legendary group of mercenary pilots known as the American Volunteer Group, the Flying Tigers. Under the command of the brilliant and cantankerous Claire Chennault, Howard flew the rugged and often unforgiving Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, fighting against the Japanese bombers and fighters that were terrorizing the skies over Burma and southern China. The AVG, the Flying Tigers, operated with absolutely no margin for error. They were almost always outnumbered, they were often outgunned by the more modern Japanese aircraft, they were chronically undersupplied, and they were fighting at the end of a logistical chain that was thousands of miles long. For these men, survival depended not on raw aggression, but on thinking ahead, on exploiting their own aircraft's unique strengths, and on a ruthless and unwavering refusal to ever fight fair. Howard thrived in this environment. It was here that he learned the deadly geometry of air combat. He learned to use his P-40's superior altitude performance and its incredible dive speed to his advantage. He learned how to bait his more agile Japanese opponents into a fight that was on his terms, to lure them into a bad position, a bad piece of sky. He learned, in the most brutal and unforgiving of classrooms, that survival in the air was not about aggression. It was about control. By the time the Flying Tigers were officially disbanded in 1942, James Howard had 6 confirmed kills to his name, and he had earned a quiet but solid reputation among his peers as a pilot who always, somehow, came back. When he returned to the United States and, now with a waiver for his medical issue, joined the Army Air Forces, he fully expected to be sent back to the Pacific, to the war that he knew. Instead, in a classic and ironic twist of military bureaucracy, he was sent to England, to a war, and to a sky that he did not. He was about to enter the grinder. By the late months of 1943, Captain James Howard was flying the P-51 Mustang with the 354th Fighter Squadron, part of the 355th Fighter Group. The P-51 was a truly revolutionary aircraft. It was fast, it was heavily armed, and with its new Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and its drop tanks, it possessed a long-range capability that would finally allow the American escort fighters to accompany the heavy bombers all the way to their targets deep inside Germany and all the way back. But in the winter of 1943, there were not yet enough of them. The escort coverage for the massive bomber streams was still thin, patchy, and often unreliable, and the bomber losses continued to mount with a grim and heartbreaking regularity. Howard was, by the standards of a fighter squadron, an old man. At 30 years of age, he was a combat veteran in a world of 22-year-old novices. His quiet, reserved, and almost academic demeanor set him even further apart. He didn't drink much, he didn't chase the local girls, he didn't engage in the loud, boisterous, and often desperate thrill-seeking that characterized the off-duty lives of so many of his younger comrades. He studied the after-action reports, he thought in systems, while the other pilots in the ready room would talk in excited, animated tones about their kills, about the visceral, one-on-one thrill of the dogfight. Howard would talk about angles. While the others were focused on the drama of their own individual battles, Howard was watching how the larger formations moved, like complex pieces on a three-dimensional chessboard. He flew not with the gut instinct of a born warrior, but with the cool, detached precision of a man who was solving a complex mathematical equation in real time at 400 miles per hour. The mission for January 11, 1944 was a maximum range effort. A massive force of over 600 American bombers was headed for a series of critical aircraft manufacturing plants deep in central Germany. The P-51 Mustangs of Howard's group, along with other escort units, would have just enough fuel to accompany them to the target area, to engage the enemy fighters for a few precious minutes, and then to race for home on the last of their own fuel reserves. The weather over the North Sea that morning was poor. A thick, impenetrable layer of cloud cover scattered the bomber formations. The radio discipline, which was supposed to be absolute, began to deteriorate as the different bomber groups and their fighter escorts struggled to maintain any kind of visual contact with each other. The great single powerful bomber stream, the very heart of the American defensive doctrine, began to stretch, to thin, and to fracture into a series of smaller, more vulnerable, and increasingly isolated groups. And then, as they crossed into German airspace, the Luftwaffe appeared. Dozens and then hundreds of German fighters emerged from the haze, climbing high above the scattered bomber formations and positioning themselves with a lethal and practiced precision. The Luftwaffe had turned the art of interception into a deadly and unforgiving choreography. The American P-51 escorts, what was left of them, immediately engaged the enemy. A series of swirling, chaotic dogfights erupted across a 100-mile stretch of the winter sky. The carefully planned formations dissolved completely. American pilots were now chasing German attackers. They were defending the bombers, and they were burning through the precious fuel that they could not, under any circumstances, spare. And then James Howard saw them. Far below him, a group of roughly 30 B-17s from the 401st Bomb Group had drifted far to the west, completely separated from the main bomber stream, and climbing up to meet them, unopposed, were at least a dozen German fighters, a mix of single-engine Messerschmitts and twin-engine, heavily armed Zerstörer destroyer aircraft. Howard checked his fuel gauge. He was already approaching the point of no return. He checked his position on the map. He was deep inside enemy territory. He tried his radio, hoping to call for help from any other nearby American fighters. Static. There were no other American fighters nearby. He was completely and utterly alone. If he were to turn back now to follow his orders and to head for home, he might, just might, make it back to England. If he stayed, he would be one man in one aircraft against an overwhelming and certain death. The military doctrine, the official flight manual, offered no guidance for this situation. This was not in the book. James Howard pushed the throttle of his P-51 forward, and he flew straight into history. The German fighters, a formidable force of over 30 aircraft by some estimates, had not yet fully committed to their attack. They were still in the process of setting up their classic, rolling, head-on passes, a deadly choreography that they had perfected over the past year. James Howard knew in that split second of decision that he possessed one single and fleeting advantage, the element of surprise. He pushed the nose of his P-51 down and dove towards the vulnerable bomber formation, his Merlin engine screaming at full power. As the first wave of German fighters, a group of twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf-110s, rolled into their attack run, Howard fired. His 6 50-caliber machine guns spit a stream of tracers that clipped the wing of one of the heavy German fighters. The Messerschmitt, its attack run spoiled, broke away from the formation, trailing a thin line of black smoke. The rest of the German formation, stunned by the sudden and unexpected appearance of an American escort fighter in a sector of the sky they had believed to be completely clear, scattered in momentary confusion. That confusion rippled through the entire Luftwaffe force. A single, lone escort was not supposed to matter. According to their own rigid calculations, one American fighter was a nuisance, not a credible threat. It could be ignored, or it could be quickly swatted from the sky by a dedicated section of their own fighters, leaving the rest of the force free to savage the bombers. But James Howard did not fly like a conventional escort fighter. He did not engage in the wild, swirling, individualistic dogfights that the Germans were expecting. He stayed close to the bombers, a lone silver sentry, a sheepdog guarding its flock. He did not chase the kills. He did not allow himself to be lured away from the formation by the promise of an easy victory. He made himself the central and unavoidable problem that every single German pilot had to solve before they could even begin to think about reaching their real target, the B-17s. Again and again, the disciplined and determined German pilots pressed their attacks. They came in from all angles. There were the classic head-on passes. There were beam attacks, slashing in from the side. There were slashing high-speed dives from above, and Howard, with a superhuman display of skill, of energy management, and of pure, cold, tactical brilliance, met every single one of them. He would fly directly into the path of an oncoming attacker, his own guns blazing, forcing them to break off their attack at the last possible second. He would use his P-51 superior speed and agility to disrupt their formations, to spoil their aim, to force them to constantly reset and to reposition. He was not trying to shoot them all down. He knew that was an impossibility. He was simply trying to disrupt their choreography. He was a single, chaotic element, a grain of sand thrown into the perfectly calibrated gears of the German attack machine. And for a few precious minutes, it worked. The German attacks became disorganized, sporadic, and ineffective. Then, with his ammunition for his 4 wing-mounted guns already running low, he did something that no one, not the Germans, not the American bomber crews, and certainly not his own commanders back in England, would have ever expected. He flew his fighter directly into the middle of the B-17 bomber formation. The American escort doctrine was clear, it was absolute, and it was drilled into every single fighter pilot. Fighters stay outside the bomber formation. To fly inside the box was to enter a terrifying three-dimensional crossfire from the bomber's own 50 caliber machine guns. The bomber gunners were young, they were terrified, and they were trained to shoot at anything that moved fast and had a single engine. Flying into the formation was not just a violation of the rules, it was an act of suicide. But James Howard, the quiet man who thought in systems, had made a different calculation. He knew that the German pilots relied on the clean, open geometry of the sky to set up their attacks. By placing his own lone P-51 in amongst the massive, lumbering B-17s, he was deliberately, and with a stroke of pure genius, fouling that geometry. He was using the bomber formation itself as a shield and as a weapon. The German pilots, their own attack runs now hopelessly complicated by the presence of this single, rogue American fighter weaving in and out of the bomber stream, were forced to hesitate. To fire at the P-51 now meant risking hitting one of the B-17s. To ignore the P-51 meant leaving themselves exposed to its guns. For 30 almost unbelievable minutes, this single, solitary American pilot held off a force of more than 30 German fighters. He flew with a kind of controlled fury, his P-51 a blur of silver against the backdrop of the dark green bombers. He had only a single, nose-mounted machine gun still firing, but he used it with a devastating and theatrical precision, making his single fighter seem as if it were everywhere at once. He would appear in a German pilot's gun sight for a moment and then vanish behind the massive wing of a B-17. He would then reappear moments later on another fighter's tail. The German attack, which had begun as a disciplined, professional and certain kill, now devolved into a frustrated and chaotic mess. The Luftwaffe pilots, their fuel running low and their patience exhausted, finally disengaged, turning for home, having failed to shoot down a single bomber while under Howard's protection. In the cockpits of the B-17s of the 401st Bomb Group, the crews were in a state of stunned disbelief. Their own radio channels, which just a half hour before had been filled with the calm, professional reports of a standard mission, were now a babbling, joyous, and almost hysterical chorus of praise and of wonder. "Who is that guy?" one pilot shouted. "I don't know, but he's a one-man air force," another one replied. "My God, did you see that? He's flying right through our formation." When the bombers finally returned to their base in England that evening, the story of the one-man air force had already become a legend. The commander of the 401st Bomb Group, a Colonel Harold W. Bowman, in his official after-action report, would write that it was the greatest display of courage that I have ever seen. He recommended Howard for the Medal of Honor. James Howard himself, his own ammunition completely exhausted, his fuel tanks running on empty, had made it back to his own base. He landed his P-51, which was miraculously untouched by enemy fire, and he said nothing. He simply filled out his own dry and typically understated report, noting that he had engaged the enemy, that he had fired his guns, and that he had returned to base. It was only when the intelligence officers began to cross-reference his report with the incredible, almost mythical accounts from the bomber crews that the true scale of his achievement became clear. James Howard was awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor. He was the only fighter pilot in the European theater of operations to be so honored during the entire war. He would later say, in his own quiet and self-effacing way, that he had simply been doing his job. But the men whose lives he had saved that day knew better. They knew that they had witnessed something more than just a job well done. They had witnessed a moment when a single, quiet, and thoughtful man had stared at an impossible equation and had, through a combination of skill, of courage, and of a brilliant and unorthodox mind, found a way to solve it. He had broken the sky.